From December the 8th, 1941, until January the 27th, 1945, millions of Jews across Europe were deported to and murdered in 8 different extermination camps. These camps, which were located primarily in Poland, but also in Belarus and Serbia, were Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Maly Trostenets, Semlin, Sobibor, Treblinka, and of course Auschwitz. Given that the extermination camps were among the most crucial catalysts of the final solution, it seems logical that Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler took the time to ensure that every site was running smoothly, to ensure maximum efficiency. However, during the course of the war, Himmler likely made visits to only 4 of the 8 facilities, that being the Action Reinhard death camps of Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, and of course, the ever so infamous central murder hub of Auschwitz. Himmler almost certainly never made visits to the extermination camps of Maly Trostenets in Semlin, primarily because they were significantly less prevalent in the scope of the final solution when compared to the other camps, and also because they were much further away from Himmler's sphere of influence, as it were, both geographically and in terms of SS hierarchy trees. Maly Trostenets in Semlin were not only ignored by Himmler, but have also been ignored by the majority of Second World War and Holocaust historians. Both camps are regularly omitted from the category of extermination camp, and one is often hard-pressed to find any reference to them in overviews or monographs on the Holocaust. When considering Majdanek, it is rather ambiguous as to whether or not Himmler ever toured the camp. Sure, Himmler visited Lublin, where Majdanek resided, on multiple occasions during the course of the Second World War, with his most notable visit being on July the 18th, 1942, in which he met with SS Gruppenführer Odilo Globoknik to discuss the future of Operation Reinhardt. During the course of his July 1942 visit to Lublin, Himmler visited both the Trawniki concentration camp and the Sobibor extermination camp on July the 19th, but it is possible that Globoknik gave Himmler a quick tour of Majdanek around this date, possibly on the afternoon or evening of July the 19th. Himmler then returned to Lublin in the February of 1943, in anticipation of a second visit to Sobibor. Once again, the Reichsführer SS might have visited Majdanek during this period, but once again, it is seemingly unconfirmed to me as of now. As for Chelmno, which was Nazi Germany's first extermination camp, we have a situation fairly similar to Majdanek. According to Patrick Montague, Himmler visited the Lodz ghetto area on April the 16th and April the 17th, 1942, in particular visiting the Polish town of Cholo to meet with Baltic Germans who had recently been resettled there. Now, given that Cholo was a mere 10-minute drive from the Chelmno extermination camp, Himmler might have visited the camp on this date, especially because, by this point in time, Chelmno had been operational for just over 4 months. However, I am not aware of any record or testimony about such a visit, nor are prominent Chelmno historians like Patrick Montague, so it seems rather unlikely, but still entirely possible. As for the camps that Himmler almost certainly did visit, the number of times he visited each and every one is also a matter of controversy. While Himmler's 2 visits to Auschwitz are both very well established, his possible 2 visits to Belzec are far less so, especially his potential visit to the camp in the August of 1942. Himmler was only recorded to have visited Treblinka once, but likely went to Sobibor twice. Within the scope of this documentary, I am not only going to analyse the historical legitimacy of each of Himmler's visits, but also the reasons for why he visited, the content of these tours, and of course, the ramifications of them. I will commence with his visits to Auschwitz, which are the best established, and then work my way through Himmler's tours of Sobibor, Belzec and Treblinka. Like all of my work, this documentary was researched using a mixture of primary sources and secondary readings, all of which you can find in my bibliography, detailed in the video description. One might think that Himmler's double visit to Auschwitz was simply because the camp was the most prolific, and ergo most important, within the scope of the final solution. Now, while that assumption is partially correct, the overall reasoning for why Himmler visited Auschwitz twice is far more complicated. You see, Himmler's close links to Auschwitz started far earlier than his ties to the other extermination camps, with his involvement in the camp originating as early as January 1940. At the time, Himmler was in the process of reasserting his dominance over Nazi Germany's growing concentration camp network, referred to as the KZs or KLs. Determined not to allow his SS subordinates to open camps without his permission, Himmler, around this time, had made an example of SS Obergruppenführer Richard Hildebrandt, the Gauleiter of Danzig, West Prussia, who had established his own camp at Stutthof. Irritated by Hildebrandt's decision not to consult him, Himmler reprimanded Hildebrandt, claiming that his actions would detract from Himmler's vision of the SS as a unified organisation. Eager to stamp his authority down following the incident at Stutthof, Himmler reacted far more aggressively come January 1940, when SS Obergruppenführer Erich von Dembach-Zalewski decided to erect a detention camp in a former artillery barracks near the Polish town of Auschwitz. Utilising his veto power as Reichsführer SS, Himmler seized the property and decided to erect a new concentration camp there instead, following the advice from SS Gruppenführer Richard Glucks. At the time, there were no plans in place for Auschwitz to become an extermination camp, as the final solution, as we now know it, wasn't properly initiated until the summer of 1941. Therefore, the original Auschwitz, or Auschwitz I, was merely designed with the intent of becoming a concentration camp, or KL. Once Auschwitz I had been established as a KL, Himmler reassigned the then commandant of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a man who would eventually reach the title of SS Obersturmbannführer, the infamous Rudolf Höss, to be Auschwitz's new commandant. On May 20th, 1940, Auschwitz received its first batch of prisoners, some 30 inmates from Höss's old stomping grounds at Sachsenhausen. For the remainder of 1940, transports of largely Polish prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, giving it a prisoner population of roughly 11,000 by the time of Himmler's first visit, in the March of 1941. In early 1941, before his first visit to Auschwitz, Himmler was contacted by IG Farben, a chemical company that was interested in constructing a large synthetic rubber plant in Auschwitz, hoping to utilise the cheap, or ideally, free labour that they would find among its inmates. Himmler, who was delighted by this proposal, promised IG Farben that their wish would be fulfilled, and that Auschwitz would consequently undergo major expansion, to ensure that they had as much access to human capital and human labour as they needed. Following this promise, Heinrich Himmler made his first visit to Auschwitz on March 1st, 1941, to both aid in the design of the camp and to cooperate with IG Farben over the construction of their new synthetic rubber factory. During his March 1941 tour, Himmler was shown Auschwitz I, that being the main camp, and the potential site for Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, a new site where IG Farben were looking to establish their new factory. During this preliminary tour, Himmler informed Höss that Auschwitz would now be expected to contain as many as 30,000 inmates, with the rapid expansion of both Auschwitz I and the plan to erect Monowitz, or Auschwitz III, in the April of 1941. Both Höss and the Gauleiter of Upper Silesia, at being Fritz Bracht, objected to such a rapid expansion, citing a lack of resources, builders, and time. Himmler, who was irritated by such opposition, succinctly stated to Bracht, Höss, and the other SS subordinates the following at the end of his tour. Quote, "Gentlemen, the camp will be expanded. My reasons for it are far more important than your objections." Unquote. There is also some speculation that Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, was also formulated during Himmler's first tour of Auschwitz. Birkenau, although later transformed into an extermination camp, was originally designed to be a large prisoner of war camp to help accommodate the thousands and thousands of Soviet POWs anticipated to be captured following Operation Barbarossa. Therefore, it is possible that this was foresight on Himmler's part, as Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was initially forecast to commence far earlier than June 22nd, 1941. Barbarossa was actually delayed, much to Hitler's frustration, due to the necessity to knock both Yugoslavia and Greece out of the war, following Mussolini's bungling invasion of Greece and a recent coup d'etat in Yugoslavia, which had overthrown the pro-Axis government previously installed there. Therefore, on April 6, 1941, Nazi Germany and its allies invaded Yugoslavia, delaying Operation Barbarossa. But, as March the 1st was just over a month before the invasion, Himmler may still have been under the illusion that Barbarossa were to be initiated sooner, supporting the idea that he wished to construct a POW camp at Auschwitz, allowing one to backdate Birkenau's inception to the March of 1941. However, Lawrence Rees convincingly criticises theories like this in his book Auschwitz, the Nazis and the Final Solution, where he utilises a culmination of primary sources as a means to attack the March 1941 theory. A document from the Auschwitz Construction Office, dated September 12, 1941, and titled Explanatory Report regarding the preliminary draft for the construction and expansion of the Auschwitz concentration camp, contains a detailed description of both the present state and future expansion plans for the Auschwitz camp, boasting a theoretical capacity of up to 30,000 prisoners. But there is no mention anywhere in this document, or in its various attachments, of any planned camp to be built at Birkenau. Therefore, one might assume that even on September 12, 1941, no formal plans yet existed for the construction of Birkenau. In fact, it was likely not until the second week of September 1941 that the plan to construct a new POW camp at Birkenau was finalised. On September 15th, Himmler discussed the issue of Soviet POWs with Reinhard Heydrich and Oswald Pohl. This was followed by a telephone conversation with Pohl the next day, which, according to a note in Himmler's diary, concerned, quote, 100,000 Russians, unquote, who were to be, quote, taken over, unquote, by the KZ or KL concentration camp system. On September the 26th, Hans Kammler, head of the Central SS Buildings Office, finally ordered the construction of a new POW camp at Auschwitz. Thus, all of Rees's evidence points to the final decision to construct Birkenau being taken in the September of 1941 and not the March of 1941. It remains possible, of course, that Himmler first saw the possibilities of Birkenau when he visited Auschwitz in the March of 1941, and might have even mentioned to Höss that it might one day be a suitable location for expansion. But, as Rees's evidence reveals, no concrete decision about Birkenau was officially taken until September 1941. Personally, I think that Himmler might have likely scoped Auschwitz in the March of 1941 and thought that one could erect a POW camp at Birkenau, but ultimately had this idea delayed by the delay of Operation Barbarossa. Hence, the designs for such a project were delayed until mid-September, at which point the Wehrmacht were deep into the Soviet Union, and the necessity for larger POW camps was far more apparent. On July the 17th, 1942, roughly 15 months after his first visit to Auschwitz, Himmler returned to the death camp for his second and final inspection. In those 15 months, the camp had transformed into more of the sprawling behemoth that we know it for today, although, even at this point, Auschwitz was still yet to undergo major expansion. Following his arrival into Auschwitz I, Himmler was taken to Höss's office, where the Reichsführer SS was shown a map of the camp, with all of its labyrinthic twists and turns. Eager to see his vision realised, Himmler's first stop on the tour was the extermination camp at Auschwitz II, or Birkenau. As the first part of his tour of Auschwitz II, Höss showed Himmler the gypsy camp, where the commandant complained to the Reichsführer about the staggeringly high rate of child mortality. Although it might seem a little ironic for Höss to care about the mortality rates in an extermination camp of all places, the gypsy camp was considered by the commandant to be a bad look for Auschwitz, which reflected upon him. Its filthy conditions, rampant mortality rate, and cramped living quarters were the hallmark of incompetence for Höss, which he attributed to a lack of funding and a poor selection of staff. Unsurprisingly, Himmler was irritated by yet more whining from his subordinates, and curtly informed Höss of the following, which the Auschwitz commandant recalled in his autobiography. Quote, "I want to hear no more about difficulties. An SS officer does not recognise difficulties, and when they arise, his task is to remove them at once by his own efforts. How this is to be done is your worry and not mine." Unquote. After scolding Höss, Himmler was then taken to the extermination area, where he witnessed the gassing of a group of Dutch Jews in one of Birkenau's first gas chambers, known as the Little White House or Bunker 2. Auschwitz's Little White House had been operational as a gassing facility since the June of 1942, with the original gassing facility, called the Little Red House or Bunker 1, commencing gassing operations in the March of 1942, in temporal parallel with the opening of the Belzec extermination camp. During the gassing, Höss remarked that Himmler, quote, "remained silent, unobtrusively observing the officers that engaged in the proceedings." Unquote. Following the gassing, Himmler was then shown the rather fledgling burial process, just saw the protocol at Auschwitz at the time. Although Action 1005 had been initiated a month prior, in the June of 1942, SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel had only experimented with mass body burning techniques at this point in time at the Chelmno extermination camp. At this point in the July of 1942, Birkenau's infamous crematoria and adjacent gas chamber buildings were yet to be constructed. After the gassing, Höss took Himmler to Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, to show him IG Farben's new synthetic rubber factory. During this tour, Himmler pressed the IG Farben officials on the working conditions and capabilities of its prisoners, urging them to accelerate efficiency. He pushed this, all while informing them that their workers would now be receiving even fewer rations than before, due to the issues of feeding all of the occupied territories recently captured in the east. Once Himmler's inspection of Monowitz had concluded, the Reichsführer, Höss, and the other notable Auschwitz SS attended a dinner on the eve of July the 17th, 1942. Before the sit-down meal began, Himmler did a sort of meet and greet with the higher-ranking SS working in and around Auschwitz, talking to the men about their daily routines, families, and current affairs. During dinner, Himmler sat next to Höss, with the latter pressing Himmler on the issues of incompetence among his SS guards, begging the Reichsführer to supply him with better officers. Himmler, who was well aware that Vollblau, the German push towards the oil fields in the Caucasus, was in full effect at this point, knew the importance of having the more military-minded and fitter young men fighting at the front. After all, a death camp is not a battlefield. As such, he told Höss the following, quote, "I need every officer, junior officer, and man who is capable of serving on the front line. For the same reasons, it is impossible to increase the strength of the guard. You could use more dogs for this purpose instead. I will get my expert in dog handling to call on you in a few days and explain the new method of using dogs as a substitute for guards. The number of escapees from Auschwitz is unusually high and unprecedented in a concentration camp. I approve of every means, I repeat, every means being used to prevent these escapes. This escape disease, which has now become rampant in Auschwitz, must be eradicated." Unquote. Although Höss effectively described Himmler to be a miserable git during his tour of Auschwitz, which makes complete sense, given how horrible the camp was, he apparently lightened up that evening and partook in activities that he normally wouldn't. According to Höss, Himmler was, quote, "in the best of spirits, taking a leading role in the conversation and being extremely amicable, especially towards the ladies. He tried on every possible subject which came up in the conversation. He discussed the education of children, of buildings and books and pictures. He spoke about his experiences with the frontline divisions of the SS and even his visits to the front with the Führer." Unquote. Himmler, who was also rather po-faced normally about frivolities and drinking, decided that evening to indulge in a bottle of red wine and even light up a few cigars. As Höss said, quote, "I had never known him like that before." Unquote. Of course, such a reaction makes sense, given that Himmler had just witnessed a tour of Auschwitz. Drinking and smoking would be a welcome distraction and an easy means to numb oneself after a day of touring a place of such depravity. On day 2, that being July the 18th, 1942, Höss gave Himmler a tour of the women's camp in Auschwitz I, in which he observed the whipping of a non-Jewish female prisoner, a prostitute who'd been caught stealing from the camp stores. However, what was far more striking to me was Himmler's discussion with a small number of non-Jewish female prisoners who had been sent to Auschwitz for petty crimes. After talking to each of them individually, Himmler personally ordered their releases. Later that same morning, the Reichsführer even spent a little bit of time debating some of the female Jehovah's Witnesses, arguing with them about their beliefs. Once he had finished debating, Himmler held a final conference in Höss's office, where he announced the following. Quote, "I have now made a thorough inspection of Auschwitz. I have seen everything, and I have seen enough of its deficiencies and difficulties, and I have certainly heard enough of them from you. I can, however, do nothing to alter them. You will have to manage as best you can. We are now in the middle of a war, and we must learn to think in terms of war. The actions which I have ordered the security police to carry out will not be stopped under any circumstances, least of all because of a lack of accommodation and so on, which I have been shown. Eichmann's programme will continue to be carried out, and will be intensified month by month. You must see to it that swift progress is made with the building of Birkenau. The gypsies are to be destroyed. The Jews who are unfit for work are to be destroyed with the same ruthlessness. Soon, the labour camps at the armament factories will absorb the first large contingents of able-bodied Jews, and that will give you some breathing space once again." Unquote. Once Himmler had finished, he then personally promoted Höss to the role of Obersturmbannführer, impressed with what he had achieved thus far. After saying his farewells, the Reichsführer SS departed Auschwitz for the final time. He would never return. The date of Himmler's final visit to Auschwitz, that being July the 18th, 1942, was roughly 2.5 years before Auschwitz was eventually liberated by the Red Army on January the 27th, 1945. From the time of Himmler's final visit, the camp underwent further developments and transformations, especially in Birkenau. Yet, despite these changes, Himmler never returned to Auschwitz to see the final model, as it were. Despite Auschwitz's central role in the Holocaust, the Reichsführer SS never toured the camp ever again. Instead, Himmler focused his future visits on the significantly smaller, albeit relatively far more lethal, Action Reinhard death camps of Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. He also wasted no time in doing so, as after he had concluded his final tour of Auschwitz on July the 18th, 1942, Himmler was then immediately driven to Lublin, from which he then visited the Sobibor extermination camp on July the 19th, 1942. It was the first of his 2 visits to Sobibor, which will be examined and discussed now. During my research, I converged on the notion that it was likely that Himmler visited Sobibor for the first time on July the 19th, 1942, a day after his aforementioned second visit to Auschwitz had concluded. On July the 18th, 1942, Himmler was driven to Lublin to meet with SS Gruppenführer Odilo Globoknek in order to discuss the future of Operation Reinhardt, which, at the time, was the Nazi plan to annihilate the Jews of the General Government District of Poland in the extermination camps of Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. Although Action Reinhardt primarily targeted the Jews of the General Government of Poland, its scope was pan-European and became increasingly more so as the war progressed. It is also interesting to note that Himmler's visit to Lublin was precisely 4 days before Gross Action Warsaw, the operation that saw hundreds of thousands of Jews deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to the newly opened Treblinka extermination camp. Ergo, one finds that July 1942 was one of the most significant months within the scope of the final solution, as it saw a major acceleration of Operation Reinhardt, the opening of Treblinka, and Himmler's visits to both Auschwitz and Sobibor. Following his arrival into Lublin on July the 18th, 1942, Himmler held a meeting with SS Gruppenführer Odilo Globoknek to discuss the current progress of, and future of, Operation Reinhardt. During this visit to Lublin, Himmler informed Globoknek that the Majdanek concentration camp would now be included within the exterminatory aspect of Operation Reinhardt, leading to the eventual establishment of Majdanek's respective gas chambers and crematoria. Himmler also likely mentioned to Globoknik of his dream of converting Majdanek into the prototype of his vision of a future colossal concentration camp model, which could hold up to tens or even hundreds of thousands of prisoners, who, through a longer form of extermination through labour, would contribute to the Reich like serfs on borrowed time, as it were. Now, if Himmler's fantasies here seem contradictory to you, especially in the context of this particular visit, which was to inform Globoknik of Operation Reinhardt's imminent acceleration, then you would be correct. After all, Himmler was, above all else, a fantasist. Over the course of the war, Himmler had a great many plans that were either wholly unrealistic or massively contradictory. In this instance, as the Jews were being annihilated in the gas chambers of Belzec and Sobibor, Himmler was fantasizing about how he would enslave them all in gigantic concentration camps, even though he was currently in Lublin to discuss the accelerated annihilation of the people that he eventually wished to enslave, en masse. Sounds ridiculous? That's because it is. Lots of the top-ranking Nazis are often remembered as being rather intelligent, and while this is certainly true in the cases of Dr. Josef Goebbels and Reinhard Heydrich, it sadly didn't apply to old Uncle Heinrich. If you need any evidence that Himmler was massively delusional, and not nearly as clever as he thought he was, then simply read about the final days of the Third Reich, in which Himmler was convinced that the Western Allies would accept him as Germany's new leader, leading to multiple attempts on his part to contact Field Marshal Eisenhower. But I digress. Once Himmler had finished his conversation with Globoknik in Lublin on July the 18th, 1942, he turned in for the night, in anticipation of a very busy day ahead, on July the 19th. Before Himmler visited Sobibor on July the 19th, 1942, he first visited the Trawniki concentration camp in the morning, which, at the time, was primarily utilised as a forced labour camp for able-bodied Jews. However, Trawniki is best known for its training programme, which saw the conversion of primarily former Soviet POWs into the Trawniki men, who were, as Peter Black so aptly put it, the foot soldiers of Operation Reinhardt. At Trawniki, the primarily Ukrainian former Red Army soldiers would be given basic ideological and military training, as well as practice in handling live prisoners, given the camp's alternative purpose of forced labour. Following their graduation from Trawniki, these men would then be posted to one of the Action Reinhardt death camps, that being either Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka. After his brief tour of Trawniki, Himmler was then driven to Chelmno, where he awaited a, quote, special transport, unquote, which would take him and his subordinates to Sobibor. Moshe Shkarjlek recalls Himmler's July 1942 visit as follows. Quote, "It was the July of 1942. I remember this incident well. I remember that 2 hours before the arrival of his train, my friend Joseph Pines and I were called to polish the officers' boots. The officers' quarters were near the platform. At approximately 11 or 11:30, 2 hours after I'd been called, I saw a luxury train pull into Sobibor. The victims who had arrived in those days were brought in freight carts, with all kinds of belongings hanging out of the carts. This one was instead a train with passenger carriages. A group of senior officers alighted from it, headed by Himmler, who stood out with his spectacles and his long coat." Unquote. During this visit, SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Stangl showed Himmler the camp, which was still relatively fledgling at this point in the July of 1942. On the day of Himmler's visit, no transport arrived at the camp, so it is unlikely that Himmler witnessed a gassing in Lager 3, the extermination area. In all likelihood, Himmler's visit to Sobibor on July the 19th, 1942 was a brief one, as a means for the Reichsführer SS to witness the foundations of an Action Reinhardt facility. The ramifications of his visit, however, were apparent in the weeks and months following Himmler's first visit to Sobibor. Firstly, in the autumn of 1942, the Sobibor SS began to implement SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel's Action 1005, presumably as Himmler had observed the issues Sobibor was having in the July of 1942, when its first mass grave overflowed and created what SS Oberscharführer Kurt Belender referred to as an, quote, unworkable stench, unquote. Given that Blobel had initiated Action 1005 in the June of 1942, first experimenting at Chelmno, it is likely that Himmler recommended to the Sobibor SS to begin burning the bodies instead of just burying them, in line with Blobel's Action 1005. Secondly, the camp itself was rapidly expanded, with new barracks and admin buildings being erected in the following weeks and months. Following a transport moratorium at the end of July, Sobibor also faced 2 months of relative quiet until the October of 1942, when it started to receive non-local Jews once again. During this period, the old gas chambers were torn down, and bigger ones were constructed. Ergo, it is highly likely that Himmler informed Stangl, following his first inspection of Sobibor, that the size of the camp and the killing capacity of its gas chambers would be insufficient within the imminent acceleration of Operation Reinhard, leading to Stangl's successor, that being SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Karl Reichleitner, to heed Himmler's warning and consequently construct bigger, newer gas chambers. Roughly 7 months later, in early February 1943, Franz Karl Reichleitner, who was still Sobibor's commandant at the time, received word that Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler would once again visit Sobibor on February 12, 1943. Reichleitner, who was eager to impress Himmler, ensured that everything was prepared in ample time for the Reichsführer's visit. As part of his preparations, Reichleitner ordered that roughly 100 Jewish girls be transferred from the Lublin region to Sobibor by truck, with the historian Marek Bem speculating that these girls might have arrived from the Trawniki concentration camp. Esther Raab, who survived the Sobibor revolt, recalled the arrival of the 100 girls as follows. Quote, "The girls arrived, and they were put up in Lager 1. During this time, I saw Gomersky, Wagner, and the others going into the barracks, which were always followed by the girls screaming. I presumed they were being beaten. After Himmler arrived, the girls were taken to Lager 2, where they had to undress in front of him. Their hair was also cut short by our male workers from Lager 1. Unquote. As Raab alluded to in her testimony, Reichleitner had imported these women as sacrificial lambs for Himmler's imminent visit. No transports arrived at Sobibor on February 12, 1943. So to be able to show the Reichsführer SS how the gassing operations worked, the Reichleitner had to import victims from Lublin. Then, on February 12, 1943, the big day finally came. Heinrich Himmler arrived in Sobibor with SS Sturmbannführer Christian Wirth, overseer of the Action Reinhard death camps, and the former commandant of Belzec. Following Himmler's arrival into Sobibor, Reichleitner wasted no time showing the Reichsführer SS and the overseer of Operation Reinhard the extermination procedures at the camp. Himmler was taken to Lager 2, where he observed the shearing and undressing of the aforementioned 100 Jewish girls from Lublin, before observing their sprint down the tube towards Lager 3, the extermination area. Once in Lager 3, Himmler observed the gassing and then the burning of the corpses, in line with Action 1005. SS Oberscharführer Hubert Gomersky recalled Himmler's visit as follows. Quote, I remember the visit of the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler to Sobibor. All the SS men, members of the police, and the Ukrainian volunteers were lined up in a parade. I personally reported to my platoon for Himmler for inspection. I know that on the day when Himmler visited Sobibor, a certain number of Jews were gassed. I can tell for sure that Himmler visited Camp 3, that being the extermination area, as I saw Himmler with a large group of officers heading in the direction of Camp 3. Unquote. SS Oberscharführer Karl Frenzel recalled his role of patrolling the perimeter during Himmler's visit. Quote, I was assigned to patrol the outside of the camp with some of the Ukrainian guards to ensure Himmler's personal safety. While Himmler was observing the gassing procedure in Lager 3, I secured the surrounding area in Lager 4. Unquote. After witnessing the observatory gassing, Reichleitner took Himmler to Sobibor's canteen, where a lavish spread had been prepared for him, on a table decorated with flowers. After enjoying some food and drink, Himmler then gave a short speech to the Sobibor SS, in which he praised them for their efficiency and strength of character in the face of a very difficult task. According to Jules Schelvis, Himmler told the Sobibor SS the following, quote, "SS men, do not give up. The order has been given. If you are not strong, you must bear the consequences." Unquote. After his speech, Himmler then publicly promoted Reichsleitner, thanked the staff one last time, and departed. In the immediate aftermath of Himmler's second visit to Sobibor, the Reichsführer SS noted that Sobibor was, quote, "virtually idle," unquote, having accomplished its task of annihilating most of the Jews in its surrounding vicinity. Therefore, Himmler decided to select Sobibor to be the future destination for transports from both France and the Netherlands, with roughly 34,000 Jews being deported from the Westerbork transit camp to Sobibor in the months following Himmler's visit in February 1943. Later that same year, Himmler also planned to try and convert Sobibor from an extermination camp into a concentration camp, or a KL. Given its proximity to Lublin, Himmler rationalized that Sobibor could rapidly expand, and then take in Jews for forced labor, from both the Lublin region and potentially from Belarus. In a letter to Oswald Pohl on July 5, 1943, Himmler outlined this vision. Quote, "The Durchgangslager Sobibor in the Lublin district must be transformed into a concentration camp and contain a facility for making confiscated munitions reusable. At this camp, there is also to be established a workshop for producing grenades and other munitions." Unquote. Pohl, who saw the transformation of Sobibor into a KL as wholly unnecessary, likely given the proximity of Majdanek, conferred with Globoknik, who agreed with him. Therefore, roughly a week later, on July 15, 1943, Pohl responded to Himmler, in which he wrote the following. Quote, "The Reichsführer, concerning your directive that Durchgangslager Sobibor in the Lublin district should be transformed into a concentration camp, I have discussed this with SS Gruppenführer Globoknik, and we both propose that you not carry out this transformation into a concentration camp, because the purpose you have in mind, that being to establish a workshop for the processing of munitions, can be achieved without this transformation." Unquote. Himmler approved of Pohl's response, and Sobibor still commenced expansion, albeit on a far smaller scale than Himmler had originally anticipated. Camps 1, 2 and 3 were all left unchanged, with the expansion coming in the form of Sobibor's new camp, that being Camp 4, or the Nordlager. In Camp 4, Himmler envisioned that Sobibor would possess several small munitions workshops, in which the inmates would convert and repair captured Soviet small arms, to eventually be reconditioned and sent back to the ever so precarious Eastern Front. Alas for Himmler, the fruits of Lager 4 were never realized, as on October 14, 1943, the Jews of Sobibor launched a very successful revolt, leading to the premature closure of the Sobibor extermination camp. Returning now to the summer of 1942, that being specifically after Himmler's visits to Auschwitz and Sobibor in the July of that year, one finds a particularly controversial visit of Himmler's, that being his first tour of the Belzec death camp. When I say controversial in this context, I mean it in terms of historical legitimacy, as historians are rather unsure as to whether or not Himmler visited Belzec at all in the summer of 1942. However, the Reichsführer's first visit to Belzec has been posited to have occurred on either August 16th or August 17th, 1942. According to the late Robert Kuwelek, Himmler visited the Lvov ghetto on August 17th, 1942, to witness the Great Action that was taking place that month. This Great Action, which started on August 10th, 1942, and ended on August 30th, 1942, saw an estimated 55,000 Jews deported from the Lvov ghetto to the Janowska concentration camp, from which they were then deported on further to Belzec. although Kuvalek cedes that no documentation supports the notion that Himmler actually witnessed the roundups and deportation procedures in Lvov, he logically assumes that, as Himmler was in the city around this time, he would have been shown them. August the 17th, 1942, is an especially striking date in the scope of Belzec's timeline, as it is around the time that SS Obersturmführer Kurt Gerstein and SS Standartenführer Wilhelm Pfannenstiel also made their infamous visit to Belzec. The exact dating of Gerstein and Pfannenstiel's visit to the camp around this time is debated, with the dates ranging from August the 16th to August the 20th, 1942. If August the 17th was the date that Himmler toured Belzec, one would imagine that Gerstein and Pfannenstiel would have accompanied the SS chieftain during their fateful visit had they gone on the same day. But neither man mentioned Himmler's presence in either of their testimonies, and Himmler's presence was certainly one that one would note upon. Ergo, we can infer from this that Himmler either visited slightly earlier, or that Gerstein and Pfannenstiel, most likely, visited slightly later. Pfannenstiel initially claimed that it was on August the 19th, 1942, that he and Gerstein, quote, witnessed an execution of Jews at Belzec, unquote, meaning that they likely arrived in the camp on August the 18th, as both men confirmed that they stayed overnight, prior to Christian Wirth's exhibit gassing. Hence, instead of August the 17th, Robin O'Neill theorises that if Himmler did visit Belzec in the August of 1942, then he would have done so on August the 16th, 1942, a few days prior to Gerstein and Pfannenstiel's visit, which I personally think makes more sense. Now, when considered in terms of geographical convenience, Himmler's visit to Belzec around this time seems fairly logical, as the Lvov ghetto and Belzec death camp were in close proximity to one another. Therefore, given that Himmler was already in the area of Lvov, it would make sense for him to inspect all the frontiers of the Holocaust in the immediate region, which would certainly include Operation Reinhardt's first death camp, that being Belzec. Such a theory is supported by the testimony of Stasi Jurkranski in the October of 1945, in which the Polish railway worker noted that Himmler visited the camp in the August of 1942, under the guard of a, quote, heavy escort, unquote. However, this visit is alleged, and very hard to prove or disprove either way. Given that Himmler had visited Sobibor the month prior, on July the 19th, 1942, it would make sense for the Reichsführer SS to then visit Belzec, to inspect how that respective Reinhardt camp was operating. The nature of this potential visit, however, is totally mysterious. Given that August was the busiest month for Belzec's gas chambers, if Himmler did visit, then he would have likely witnessed a gassing, or, at the very least, been shown the burial process, which he certainly did witness during his autumn 1942 visit to the camp. In my personal opinion, I would err on the side of this particular visit either being misdated, or, if it did happen, being very brief, and only with the purpose of Himmler inspecting Belzec's basic functionality. I reason that it might have been misdated, and thereby conflated with his later autumn 1942 visit, because, at the time of Himmler's alleged August 1942 visit to Belzec, Action 1005, the plan to obfuscate genocide through the mass burning of bodies, had already been in operation for just under 2 months. Ergo, it seems that if Himmler did visit Belzec at this time, then he would have likely remarked to the Belzec SS to initiate Action 1005. Yet, the burning of corpses didn't start in Belzec until the first week of November 1942, which was immediately after Himmler's second visit to the camp. However, Himmler might have only mentioned it in passing to the Belzec commandant and commandant aspirant at the time, who were SS Sturmbannführer Christian Wirth and SS Hauptsturmführer Gottlieb Hedding respectively, that Action 1005 would need to be implemented at some point in the camp later down the line, but that they needn't worry about it at the time, as August was an especially busy period for the camp, given the acceleration of Operation Reinhardt. After all, Himmler visited Sobibor even earlier than Belzec, on the aforementioned July the 19th, 1942 date, and that camp didn't initiate Action 1005 until the autumn of 1942. Following this line of reasoning, it is possible that Himmler did visit in the August of 1942, but was only interested in witnessing Belzec's functionality during this visit, rationalising that Action 1005 wasn't necessary to instigate during Operation Reinhardt's peak, given that Belzec's staff were already overstretched. Out of my two interpretations, it is this one that I favour more strongly. But, unless new evidence springs to light, this visit, and the content of it, will always be largely speculative. What is more likely, and better documented, was Himmler's visit to Belzec in the autumn of 1942. Historians can be more certain of this particular visit, thanks to the testimony of Belzec's most renowned survivor, Rudolf Raeder. Raeder, who had arrived in Belzec from the Lvov ghetto in mid-August 1942, had been selected following his arrival in Belzec to work as one of the Totenjuden, or the Jews of Death. Despite his advanced age of 61, Raeder's ability to understand German made him exceptionally useful to the Belzec SS, and he was thus spared from the camp's gas chambers. As one of the Totenjuden, Raeder's job was to bury the bodies of the murdered in Belzec's gaping burial pits. He recalled his time in Belzec in his memoirs, simply titled Belzec. During said memoirs, Raeder recalled the following visit from SS Chief Heinrich Himmler in the autumn of 1942. Quote, "The biggest event for those thugs was Himmler's visit. It took place sometime towards the middle of October. That day, we knew that something unusual was afoot. There was an air of secrecy all around. Everything was done with great speed. Even the process of murder that day took a much shorter time." Ehrmann then announced the following: "A distinguished guest is coming. Everything must be in order." He did not elaborate, but we all knew from the whispered exchanges of the askers, Himmler was coming. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Himmler arrived, escorted by General Major Katzmann, the butcher of Lvov and Eastern Galicia, and 10 Gestapo. Ehrmann and the others led Himmler to the gas chambers, just in time for him to see the corpses falling out. A terrible pile of young people, small children, and babies. The Jewish death commandos dragged the corpses along, while Himmler stood there watching. He stayed and watched for about half an hour, and then left the camp. I saw how pleased and uplifted the Gestapo felt. I saw their joy, and I heard them laughing. I also heard them talking of promotions." Unquote. Whether or not Himmler's visit to Belzec took place in the middle of October 1942, or towards the end of October, or even at the start of November, is debatable. Either way, Raeder's reference to Himmler having witnessed the aftermath of a gassing makes complete sense, given the abundance of transports that arrived at Belzec in the October and November of 1942. Furthermore, his reference to the Belzec SS talking about promotions after Himmler's visit also converges nicely with the ramifications of Himmler's second visits to Sobibor and also his visit to Treblinka in the February-March of 1943. You see, after Himmler had finished his tour of Treblinka, he ordered the promotions of all the high-ranking Operation Reinhardt SS, that being the commandants and their deputies. Belzec's commandant at the time, that being Gottlieb Hering, and his deputy, Gottfried Schwartz, were promoted as part of Himmler's promotions of the Reinhardt SS, supporting Raeder's testimony that he overheard the Belzec SS discussing the possibility of such. A visit from Himmler to Belzec around this period also makes sense when one considers the temporal application of Action 1005, given that SS Hauptsturmführer Gottlieb Hering commenced the obfuscation action in the first week of November 1942, which would have been shortly after Himmler's visit in either mid to late October or early November. Hering assigned SS Chefführers Fritz Toscher and Heinrich Gley to oversee the operation, with the help of SS Hauptscharführer Lorenz Hackenholt, the man who operated Belzec's gas chambers. Much like at Sobibor, an excavator was brought in to aid with exhumation, and pyres were assembled, in light of Blober's blueprint, to implement the cremation process. At the beginning of December, as Belzec's killing operations drew to a close, a second pyre was then assembled. Hence, given the temporal instigation of Action 1005 in Belzec, that being that it immediately succeeded Himmler's autumn 1942 visit, Raeder's recollection about Himmler's visit is further legitimized, strengthening the argument that Himmler did visit Belzec around that time. Out of all of the Nazi extermination camps discussed thus far, none were more prolific, relative to the time in which they were open, than Treblinka. In the span of just over a single year, the Treblinka death camp murdered around 800,000 people, with the vast majority of these victims perishing in the camp's infamous gas chambers. Despite it being the last Nazi extermination camp to be opened during the course of the Second World War, Treblinka soon made up for lost time, surpassing all of its contemporaries in terms of numbers murdered. By the time that Treblinka's gas chambers fell silent for the final time on August 19, 1943, the camp had butchered a staggering average of 72,700 people each month. Given the abundance of corpses in Treblinka's gaping burial pits, it would make sense for the camp to be the top priority for SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel's Action 1005. Blobel commenced this action in the June of 1942 by initially experimenting with mass body burning techniques at the Chelmno extermination camp, before eventually implementing these techniques across Eastern Europe. In spite of the operation commencing in June 1942, combined with the fact that Treblinka was the most prolific extermination camp at the time, Treblinka still hadn't initiated Action 1005 by late February, early March 1943. In fact, by the time that SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Stangl finally initiated Action 1005 in Treblinka, 5 of the other 8 extermination camps had already initiated the operation, with Treblinka coming in at third last to commence the action. What's even more interesting is that the only reason why Treblinka even bothered with Action 1005 at all was due to the visit from SS Chief Heinrich Himmler in late February, early March 1943. According to Vasily Grossman's famous report on Treblinka, which he called the Treblinka Hell, the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler visited Treblinka at the end of winter 1943, which leads one to infer that Himmler visited at the end of February. In Tannum Grimberg's testimony about the camp, he specifically noted that the Reichsführer SS spent about half an hour in the upper camp, or the extermination area. Around 30 minutes is enough time for Himmler to have witnessed a gassing, which could affect the likely dating of his exact visit to Treblinka. However, the likelihood that Himmler actually did witness a gassing during his visit to Treblinka is rather unlikely, due to 2 reasons. Firstly, if Himmler did witness a gassing, then the likelihood is that his visit would have coincided with the arrival of a transport. Now, this isn't absolutely necessary, as Sobibor's Franz Karl Reichleitner simply had a small group of Jews imported from Lublin when Himmler visited Sobibor. But, seeing as there is no mention for this for Treblinka, we have to assume that if Himmler did witness a gassing, then it would have coincided with the arrival of a transport. So, if one actually checks the deportation itineraries to the Treblinka extermination camp, then the earliest transport that would fulfill the end of winter or late February, early March clause would be a transport on February the 14th, 1943, which arrived at the camp from the Grodno ghetto in Belarus. However, February the 14th is mid-February, not late February, and is hardly the end of winter. However, that date is more likely than the next closest option, which would be March the 15th, when a transport of Bulgarian Jews arrived at Treblinka from Skopje. What makes the February the 14th date more likely was that it was only 2 days after Himmler had visited Sobibor, so the timing of a visit then might make more logical sense if one considers that during this period, Himmler was touring the Reinhard camps. But when one actually considers the few reports we have on Himmler's 1943 visit to Treblinka, the likelihood of him witnessing a gassing is even less likely. According to Vasily Grossman's report on the camp, when Himmler visited Treblinka, he landed on an aircraft near the camp, before being driven in. Once he had arrived, Stangl briefly showed the Reichsführer the lower camp, before he took Himmler to the upper camp, or the extermination area, where he spent the majority of his time there. Grossman report that once Himmler was in the upper camp, the Totenjuden, or Jews of Death, remarked that the Reichsführer, quote, walked over to one of the huge ditches and stared into it for a long time. Those who accompanied him kept a respectful distance, waiting while Heinrich Himmler contemplated the colossal grave already half filled with corpses. Quote. This recount is important for 2 reasons. Firstly, it makes no explicit reference to Himmler witnessing a gassing, nor do any other testimonies that I found during my research for that matter. Secondly, was the Totenjuden's recollection of Himmler's inspection of the burial pits, which points to the primary reason for why Himmler visited Sobibor in Treblinka in the first place in 1943, to ensure the implementation of Action 1005. You see, Himmler's tours of the Reinhard facilities in early 1943 were not conducted for the purpose of the Reichsführer observing how efficient their killing processes were, as that was evident by now, but was rather to oversee the implementation of Action 1005, which was now of paramount importance, given the recent German loss at Stalingrad. Given the purpose of his visit, and the omittance of any reference to Himmler witnessing a gassing in the upper camp, one can infer that Himmler probably didn't visit on either February the 14th or March the 15th, but rather in the lull period of about a month that the camp had. Now, on which exact day this visit occurred during this period, however, is still a complete mystery to me. Himmler's lengthy half-an-hour wait in the upper camp was most likely due to his surprise and irritation that Stangl hadn't initiated Action 1005 in Treblinka, and that period of time likely consisted of his inspection of the mass graves and his consequent instructions to both Stangl and his SS. Both Belzec and Sobibor had implemented Action 1005 by the time of Himmler's visit to Treblinka, and both of those camps had murdered far fewer people. Thus, it is probable that Himmler was slightly panicked during this tour, and frustrated at Stangl for not taking the initiative and commencing the operation sooner. On Himmler's 1943 tour of Treblinka, it is almost certain that SS Sturmbannführer Christian Wirth, overseer of the Action Reinhard death camps, was also present, given both his position and the fact that the latter had joined Himmler on his tour of Sobibor on February the 12th. Therefore, following Himmler's likely demands for Action 1005 to be implemented in Treblinka, Wirth ordered the reassignment of SS Scharführer Herbert Floss, who was one of Paul Blobel's body-burning experts. Floss's arrival at Treblinka thereafter is very well documented. In Gil Rachman's account of his time at the camp, he refers to Floss as an artist, a man who was first spotted at Treblinka's burial pits. Although he gets the dating slightly wrong, there is no doubt that Floss is the man that he is referring to. Grossman's report refers to a thick-set man who was an expert on body burning, who was brought into the camp to aid in the implementation of Action 1005. Despite Himmler's concerns over Action 1005, the Reichsführer SS was still impressed with Treblinka's progress thus far, and especially pleased with how Stangl had turned the camp around, considering the appalling state it was in when he had been given control after the reign of his neglectful predecessor, Dr. Imfried Ebel. As Himmler's 1943 visit to Treblinka was his last tour of the Reinhard facilities, he decided to award some of the SS in these camps with promotions. Himmler first promoted Christian Wirth, overseer of the Action Reinhard death camps, to the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, and his adjutant, Josef Oberhauser, to the role of Untersturmführer. Gottlieb Hering, Franz Karl Reichleitner, and Franz Stangl, who were the commandants of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka respectively, were all promoted to the rank of Hauptsturmführer. Each man's deputy was also promoted, that being Belzec's Gottfried Schwartz, Sobibor's Johann Niemann, and Treblinka's Kurt Franz. These men were all promoted to the role of Untersturmführer. In conclusion, during the course of the Second World War, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler was noted to have made visits to 4 of the 8 Nazi extermination camps. He visited Auschwitz and Sobibor twice, Treblinka once, and Belzec possibly twice, and almost certainly at least once. Himmler's visits to the death camps are actually a topic that I seldom see discussed, which has always been odd to me. Yes, we only have scraps of information about the content of his visits, but it is both important and interesting to consider why Himmler made these visits in the first place. Throughout this documentary, I have made use of the word tour, and the usage of that word is entirely by design. In a rather sinister analogy, Himmler can be likened to the CEO of a company, a man who occasionally toured the branches of his business to ensure that they were operating effectively and to promote his most favoured staff. Of course, Himmler's company facilitated mass murder, but that doesn't detract from the banal, almost corporate-like nature of his visits. On Himmler's second visit to Sobibor, for instance, a spread was laid out, all put on for him by his regional manager in the Reichsleitner, who was eager to impress. Yet, only half an hour prior to Himmler and Sobibor's SS tucking into sausages, cheeses and wines, did they witness the murder of a large group of women and inspected the cremation of hundreds of thousands of corpses. If nothing else, Himmler's visits to the extermination camps mark yet another bizarre angle in both the psychology of genocide and, to quote Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this documentary on Himmler's tours of Auschwitz, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka to be both informative and interesting. If you like this content, then make sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the notification for my next upload. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below. Other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.